part of the problem with postmodernism and the extreme reactions we're getting in our culture today, both against whatever it means and for it, is that nobody wants to define it. And part of the problem is I don't think it can be defined in a very quick way. Certainly when it started, it began in architecture, as you know, and it was a form of architecture that saw the disadvantages, both social and architectural, of modernist architecture. It didn't deny that modernist architecture existed, but it did try to return to things like the sense of the street, the history of our lived relation to space, and to restore things like ornament that had been destroyed with modernism. When you take that, which was the first definition of it in cultural terms, to other art forms, what I think you get is a form of very historical art. This is literature or painting, which recalls the history of other art. This is where parody comes in, because it doesn't always recall it with reverence. There's often a kind of ironic relationship with that past. But also a kind of self-reflexivity, an awareness of a self-consciousness about the act of being, fiction or painting or photography. So the combination of an ironic relationship to the past, a distanced relationship to the past, but a recalling, in other words, not the modern look forward, but a look back, combined with this self-consciousness, is I think what characterizes the postmodern.
The difference between modernism and postmodernism is not in the time, but in the conceptual organization.
One of the things that characterizes postmodernism is, that I didn't mention, is an interest in the different, the local, the particular, rather than the universal, which is a standard humanist concept, that we work with universals that have eternal value. This is quite the opposite, where one is interested in the local and the particular. And in a way, postmodernism was made possible by the civil rights movement in the United States in the 60s, by feminism, which in some ways was enabled by that, and by subsequent other groups that have made us aware of difference within that universal culture that I certainly had been taught as an undergraduate that I was studying.
To a certain extent, postmodern theory follows McLuhan, that the media is the message. The formal effects of a media have the determinative role in the impact of the media on culture. This seems half right.
For myself, the two Canadians who have probably been most influential in my own thinking would be McLuhan on the one hand, because of McLuhan's wonderful understanding of technology, which I think is just correct, and is like the beginning of Baudrillard's work, where McLuhan says that how there's been a radical change in how technologies function as power, that in fact they perform a kind of dédoublement, or they switch. Your whole being gets exteriorized, and the technology comes from within. So the technology is no longer an object which you can hold outside of yourself, but in fact becomes your identity. Your mind gets externalized. You have sort of mutant eardrums to the extent that your nerves get played by the mediascape, or you have kind of spectral vision to the extent that your even eyesight is something which is taken over by the mediascape itself, and you're positioned to see certain things and to understand certain things. So I think McLuhan, more than anyone, understood the really grisly notion of technologies as resulting in the externalization of the human mind itself.
To what extent is contemporary culture postmodern?
Right. The main insight of postmodern theory is that our contemporary society is an image producing and proliferating society. This was one of Baudrillard's early insights, that radical semiurgy, the production, the proliferation of images, characterizes the very essence, as it were, of our society. It used to be the case that in modernity, on Baudrillard's model, industrial production was what the society was all about, the production of commodities, buying, selling, consumption, etc. But even consumption, Baudrillard saw, was more and more structured around image, what he called sign value. You bought a product, you exhibited a product for its prestige. Moreover, the media do nothing but produce images. So we have these images machines that are saturating our culture with images. This is creating new modes of experience, new consciousness, in which literacy, the word, verbal discursive culture is on the decline and image culture is on the rise. So this is one essential insight of postmodern theory that helps us understand our current situation. I think the middle Baudrillard also had many insights into simulation, hyperreality, the way that models and codes are coming to constitute our experience of the world. For instance, Reagan being a simulated president. He's not a real president. He doesn't really know politics. He acts. He follows a script. There's a model of what the president should be, look like, etc., that he acts out on cue with his teleprompter, etc. So he's basically simulating the presidency, and more of our culture is being determined by these simulation models. So these are some real insights that postmodern theory has. What they do is erase very often such things as ideology, class, oppression, manipulation, etc. They're more of a descriptive theory about images and codes and hyperreality, and less of a critical theory, the way that, say, Marxism and feminism and other theories are that analyze the ideologies, the messages that are being conveyed.
The political end of it, and this is what interested me in postmodernism from the start, was I couldn't figure out why both the right, the political right, and the political left rejected postmodernism. There's something funny about this. And I think what's funny about it, and it comes back to how ironing works generally, is that postmodernism appears to be art that is critical of dominant cultural forces. So I'm thinking things like capitalism or patriarchy or even humanism as it's represented in the university. But at the same time, as it's being critical, is also complicitous with it. In other words, there's no self-congratulatory subversiveness in this because it's implicated in it. So you get art which is bestseller, novels which are bestsellers, for example, which also are being taught on postmodernism courses. And it's that combination of the complicity and the criticism that interested me in it. And what happens, I think, is that the left sees only the complicity and therefore wants to reject this. The right tends to see only the criticism and reject it without seeing the two rubbing against each other, which I think make it into the postmodern. Built into feminism and certainly into post-colonialism and Marxism is a theory of agency. A way we can move to political action that I don't see as part of the postmodern. I see the postmodern as deconstructing, as laying out the problem. And you could argue that that's the first step toward moving to action. But I don't think within postmodernism there is that move to action. And I think that's why Marxist critics like Frederick Jameson have really had to come down hard in some ways on postmodernism, where they've had to say that there is no, and they always point to the modernist avant-garde, which did have that political impulse, as the opposite. And I think they're right to some extent.
Postmodernism is classified as an exhaustion of modernism, though. Would you agree with that? Or?
No, I don't think it's an exhaustion. I think it's an ironizing of it. I think it's not, I mean, there are two camps. There's a camp that sees it as a break from modernism and the camp that sees it as a continuation, positive or negative, of modernism. Both are true to some extent, as with architecture. Architecture, certainly, postmodern architecture was a continuation of modernism insofar as it didn't stop using concrete. It didn't stop using the material advances, structural advances that modernism had brought to architecture. On the other hand, it did break from it in its politics of representation of built space. So there is a break in some ways, but a continuation in others. And the same is true in literature, where the self-reflexivity, the self-consciousness we see in postmodern literature isn't new. First of all, it's not just modernist. It goes back to Tristram Shandy, to Don Quixote in the fictional form. So that isn't new, and yet the complicity side of it, the awareness that one can't get out of the dominance that one is contesting, I see as much more a postmodern thing than a modern thing, where there was definitely a desire to get out of it and a belief that in a way one could transcend the nightmare of history that Stephen Dedalus talks about.
What you've got here, I think, is a way of characterizing, metaphorically really, what many people feel is this kind of mystical obscurantism of certain kinds of postmodernist discourse, as in Derrida, the later work of Roland Barthes. And to a certain extent in Foucault, everyone complains about the obscurity of Foucault's style. And it's obvious that those three writers, while certainly valorizing, as we say nowadays, clarity of expression, also feel themselves compelled both to celebrate and actually practice a certain systematic obscurantism. Reminding us always you can't say everything, right? That discourse is fragmented, it's broken off, it's internally inconsistent, it's undecidable, da-da-da-da-da.
But I think you're raising a very fundamental issue of contemporary anthropology about whether it's even appropriate or legitimate to pretend to know anything about anybody else. But I really disagree deeply with that, because it's an end of all inquiry. It's a return of the whole project of knowledge back into the individual inquirer, and ends up with him looking at himself and saying, look at me, how marvelously complex and frustrated I am.
So it becomes sort of solipsistic.
Absolutely solipsistic, yes.
And whereas an older anthropology was really based on a structure.
Well, based on a theory. If you haven't got a theory, you've got no right to go out. But you have to have some theoretical training, and then and that can be bad or good. And people should argue about that, but not about the possibility of knowledge. They are being nihilistic about knowledge, in my opinion, you see.
But nihilism, if you view it from the point of view of authoritative structure in society, tolerance, and so on, it's not so bad as it looks. I mean, nihilism means that our history has a sense. The sense is the dissolution of the unitary, strong, authoritative, imposive structures of the traditional thought, metaphysics, ethics, politics, authoritarian regimes, and so on. Now, modernity had already this sense, but at a certain extent, still wanted to establish strong structures. So there was a historicism in modernity, the idea of progress, for instance, which didn't accept completely pluralism. Progress was a sort of reducing the plurality of human cultures to different grades, different stages of our most civilized culture, Western culture, which named all the other people primitives, underdeveloped, and so on. They were simply steps towards the human ideal culture, which was us. Now, postmodernity is a step beyond this point, the taking into account of the pluralization as a principle of unitary interpretation of history, but which makes impossible a unitary history. The only unitary sense of history is the end, is the dissolution of the unitary sense of history. It looks paradoxical, but it is not that. I mean, we are engaged in an adventure of weakening of the strong structures. The very notion of progress and of history as a unity was the last strong structure in our cultural history. So we still have a sort of leading thread, a sort of meaning of what happens. But this meaning is the fact of the fall of all these illusions of unitary great meanings, the narratives, as Lyotard called them. So only that even Lyotard, doesn't want to recognize that the falling down of the great narratives, the great ideologies, is a narrative, because otherwise it would